Hi, I'm Jason Riley of the Manhattan Institute, and I just wanted to introduce our keynote speaker today. Ben Carson did not need to become the U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to distinguish himself in life. Before he took this job, he'd already become a world-famous pediatric neurosurgeon. He'd already made medical history by separating twins joined at the head. He'd already been the head of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, at one point performing some 500 surgeries a year, which is twice the caseload of a typical neurosurgeon. He'd already been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He'd already established an education scholarship fund for low-income kids. He'd already been a best-selling author. He'd already had a movie made about his life. Not bad for a black inner-city kid raised in poverty in the 1950s and 60s, I'd say. I became a journalist because it's really all I could do. Dr. Carson clearly had many other options in life, and I want to thank him for opting to join us today. So, Dr. Carson.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you and good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. And I'd like to thank your President Lawrence Moon and all the talented men and women who work at the Manhattan Institute, the panelists and the moderators for tackling such an important topic today, and all of you for braving the cold weather and the threats of terrorism. You know, it'll take a lot more than a failed bombing to discourage New Yorkers. So, in his 1964 address to graduates of the University of Michigan, where I went to medical school, Lyndon Johnson said, quote, "We have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. The great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are totally committed in our time." Those were good sentiments and a grand vision. The question we face today is whether the federal government has succeeded in making this vision a reality, and what it means to families seeking a good life today. As President Johnson created the programs which would ultimately form a welfare industrial complex, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was being raked over the coals for his dire warnings about the future of the black family. His famous report warned that the precarious economic situation of black men in America could become a national crisis, with social and cultural fallout affecting families for generations. You know, many have heard it said that the black male in America is an endangered species. Why do people say that? Because in many communities there are more black males incarcerated than there are in college. Because in many of our major cities, the #1 cause of death for young black males is homicide. And you know, anybody who knows anything about education knows that young black male students, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, they're good students like everybody else. What happens? That peer pressure begins to kick in. They begin to study American history. They notice there's nobody in their textbook who looks like them who really contributed much to making America great. Maybe next year when I take world history, same thing. Where do I fit in? What did my ancestors do? And then they come home and turn the TV on. Oh, there we are, playing basketball, baseball, football, rapping in those baggy pants, acting a fool on some sick comedy. You begin to get a very different impression of who you are and what success constitutes for you. And you think you're going to be the next Michael Jordan or the next Puffy Daddy or whatever. But, you know, it doesn't take long before that doesn't pan out. Next thing you know, you're looking at television, 6 o'clock news, and you see a young man being led away, handcuffs on, trying to shield his face from the cameras, having committed some heinous crime. And you say, that's little Johnny. What happened? He was such a good boy. Same thing happens to little Johnnies across this nation every single day. And it didn't have to happen, because anybody could have taken that young man by the hand when he was 6 years old and walked down the streets of Manhattan and given him a black history lesson he would have never forgotten. They could have started by pointing to his shoes, saying, you know, it was Jan Matzliger, a black man, who invented the automatic shoe lasting machine, which revolutionized the shoe industry throughout the world. And you step on that clean street and you tell them it was Charles Brooks, a black man who invented the street sweeper, the machine with the big brushes that comes down the street. And down that street comes a big refrigerated tractor trailer truck, and you tell them it was Frederick Jones, a black man who invented the refrigeration system for trucks, later adopted for airplanes, trains, boats. And it comes to a stop at the red light, and you tell them it was Garrett Morgan, a black man who invented the traffic signal. And you can also tell them that Garrett Morgan invented the gas mask, saved lots of lives during the war. And while you're talking about the war, Henrietta Bradbury, a black woman who invented the underwater cannon, made it possible to launch torpedoes from submarine. And you'll see a beautiful black woman walking down the street. A black man did not invent her, but you can use that opportunity to talk about Madam C.J. Walker, a black woman who invented cosmetic products for women of dark complexion, was the first woman of any ethnicity to become a millionaire on her own efforts in the United States of America. And you walk by the hospital and you talk about Daniel Hale Williams, the first successful open heart surgery, had an operative mortality rate less than 1.5%. You look up at the surgical light, Thomas Edison. You didn't know he was black, did you? Well, he wasn't, but his right-hand man's Lewis Latimer. Lewis Latimer invented the filament that made the light bulb work for more than 2 or 3 days. Invented the electric lamp. Diagrammed the telephone for Alexander Graham Bell. Was a tremendous inventor in his own right. You know, most people have never even heard of him. You walk past the railroad tracks. Andrew Beard invented the automatic railroad coupler, spurred on the Industrial Revolution. Elijah McCoy, the automatic lubrication system for locomotive trains. In fact, McCoy had so many inventions. When something new would come out in the industrial realm, people would say, is that a McCoy? Is that the real McCoy? You got racist people like David Duke talking about the real McCoy, don't even know who they're paying homage to. And I'm just barely scratching the surface. So you can see that young man had no reason not to believe that his ancestors played an important role in the development of this country. And you know, there's been so much self-hatred promoted amongst black people. And you're going to be in for a real treat when I get finished. You're going to hear a young man say a poem. Lord, why did you make me black? It's going to really summarize those sentiments very well. Well, you know, many people weren't interested in hearing about all the things that I just talked about, unfortunately, in Lyndon Johnson's time, or even now. But what Daniel Patrick Moynihan has certainly been validated by history. In 1965, more than 75% of African-American children were born to married mothers. That was good. And now, 50 years later, think about it. In 2015, more than 70% of African-American babies were born out of wedlock. After a half a century and $22 trillion, that massive percentage is flipped on its head. This is one of the most tragic statistics in America. It represents so much unrealized human potential, so many families deprived of the educational, moral, and psychological benefits of having a mother and a father. And it leads to a lot of poverty. You know, the Brookings Institute, many of you may be familiar with, did a study on poverty, a national study, and they concluded that there were 3 things that a person could do that would reduce their risk of living in poverty to 2% or less. 3 things. Number 1, graduate from high school. Number 2, get married. Number 3, wait until you're married to have children. Those 3 things, less than a 2% chance of living in poverty. We should be thinking about those things when we make our policies. It's not to say that single mothers can't be successful. You know, I saw my own mother by herself work 2 to 3 jobs at a time to make sure that her sons would have a better opportunity than she did. And she would always say to us, you know, there are 2 roads that you can take. You can take the road where you sit and spend all your time complaining and concentrating about unfairness and prejudice, or you can take the road of opportunity, and you can put your energy in there. And I think she was right, because one of her sons became a neurosurgeon and the other one became a rocket scientist. So I think she may have been on to something. She succeeded against long odds, odds that many families, through no fault of their own, can't beat. This trend is one of many indications that we must rethink the Great Society, how it can be achieved, whom it benefits, and which institutions are best equipped to fulfill its promise. There are indications that some policies, like the so-called man in the house rule for welfare, were directly harmful to societal stability. According to Roland Warren, the former president of the National Fatherhood Initiative, there are systems in place, well-meaning as they may be, that incentivize people to make choices that ultimately do not strengthen the black family. It also didn't help that the war on poverty sometimes conflicted with the war on drugs, which often dealt harshly with nonviolent offenders, taking men away from their families and disproportionately affecting minority communities. And of course, there's the issue of dependency itself, that our national safety net became a net trapping millions of Americans from rising above it. But many researchers point out that other factors, like the sexual revolution, changing social norms, the lack of jobs, have had a far greater impact on families, poverty, and crime than any one governmental policy, which is precisely the point. More harmful than any single government program has been the presumption that the federal government could manage affairs of human nature in the first place. It was not capable of replacing the institutions which used to nurture and guide Americans in their social activities and improvement, like local government, churches, fraternal organizations, and families themselves. These were the scalpels and sutures of civil society. But Lyndon Johnson's Great Society brought a sledgehammer to neurosurgery, to a delicate process. Of course, countless Americans have been saved from hunger, homelessness, sickness, and extreme deprivation by federal programs. Material poverty has declined as standards of living, even those who need help, have risen tremendously. Our nation deserves to be proud of such accomplishments. Right now, millions of men and women depend on the federal agency that I lead, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, for access to safe, affordable housing across the country. Government efforts have unquestionably helped many people survive, But as we see from the state of families, generational poverty, and the continuing need for assistance, our efforts have not been sufficient to let people thrive. And it's vital that our people thrive. We have 330 million people in this country. Sounds like a lot. But it's a quarter of what China has, a quarter of what India has, and we have to compete with them in the future, which means we need all of our people to thrive. We need to develop all of our people, or by sheer numbers, we will not be able to compete into the future. It is not charity to pull the rug out from under Americans who depend on the programs of the Great Society, but it is equally uncharitable to pretend that they have flourished under them. So what do? Fortunately, we have an answer, which has awaited rediscovery for 50 years. In the same speech that Lyndon Johnson gave at Michigan, he said the following, quote, "The solution to these problems does not rest on a massive program in Washington, nor can it rely solely on the strained resources of local authority. They require us to create new concepts of cooperation, a creative federalism between the national capital and the leaders of local communities." Unquote. That's what he said 50 years ago. The new model. Nothing new under the sun, because that's what we're talking about today, but now we need to enact it. It applies just as clearly to our current times. The path forward is to return to a cooperative model for social improvement, which promotes local solutions, private enterprise, and the initiative of Americans in their own communities, public-private partnerships. We must recognize that a strong economy, strong families, strong values are the key to permanently defeating poverty, and that these conditions are fostered primarily by Americans themselves in their voluntary associations rather than the federal government. We must continue to do our duty for those who have come to depend on public assistance in many forms, while refocusing this assistance to lead our countrymen back to self-sufficiency and self-determination. We will know we've succeeded when fewer Americans need our service. It will mean something different in every government agency, from more school choice in the Department of Education to unleashing free enterprise in the Department of Labor. At HUD, it means expanding job training and employment opportunities for those in low-income housing, and in areas where affordable housing is being constructed. It means we need to empower Section 3, which says if you're getting HUD money, you need to hire local low-income people. You need to train them. You need to give them contracts. It's been on the books for 49 years, hardly ever used because people say there's a gap, a skills gap. These people don't know how to weld. They don't know how to lay brick. They don't know cement work. But guess what? We have a brain with frontal lobes, with the ability to think ahead, which means we know a year, 2, 3 ahead of time that we're going to do that. Why not train the people then and have a workforce with skills that will allow them to escape poverty? We can do that. We're focusing on that now. It means founding Envision centers across the country, which leverage private sector investment and provide education, training, and counseling to young people climbing upward. Envision centers will become hubs for mentorship, because many studies have shown that low-income children who are mentored finish high school at a much higher rate than those who are not. Put people in contact with child care facilities so that those young women who interrupted their education can get their GED and their associate's degree and their bachelor's degree and become self-sufficient, but more importantly, teach that to their children so we can break the ever-growing cycle of dependency. It means providing local health care so that people don't use emergency rooms that cost 5 times more and don't provide appropriate care, so you end up with all these stage 4 diseases that don't need to be there. It means exposing the children to the myriad of jobs, careers that they'd never heard of, that many of them would be so good at. By helping Americans in diverse areas of their lives, we can start to fully and permanently raise families from poverty by engaging communities and private enterprise to help families build their own futures. Giving them ownership of their futures is the first step towards self-sufficiency that we desire for all Americans. Envision centers are going to be there to help them at every step, not with big government programs, but locally grown and driven solutions. It means reforming FHA policies and other forms of government assistance to provide a path to responsible home ownership as to many Americans as possible. This cornerstone of the American dream is a major step to independence and equity passed down through generations. And it's important to note that renters, in general, have a net worth of about $5,000, homeowners about $200,000. It's a 40-fold difference. We need to concentrate on getting people out of a rental situation, but it has to be done responsibly, because the last time it was not done responsibly, and it doesn't do anybody any good to put them in a home they can't afford. They lose their home, their credit, and their future opportunities. We're looking at responsible ways of being able to do that. It means embracing the President's executive orders to reduce regulatory burden on Americans and their businesses, especially those providing jobs and housing to fellow citizens. I can't presume to speak for my fellow secretaries nor members of Congress, but I believe this is the way forward, not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans. When we realize our opportunities and our limitations, when we empower our countrymen to determine their own futures, when we preserve a culture where family, faith, and friendship flourish, and they preserve us in turn, when we ignore the purveyors of division and hatred, and recognize that no divided society can flourish for long, as has been proven by history. And when we recognize that we have a choice in what kind of people we're going to be, are we going to allow ourselves to hate each other because we may have a difference of opinion? Or do we choose to sit down with each other and openly communicate and resolve our issues? That's going to determine whether indeed we have a great society. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those remarks, Dr. Carson. We have a few minutes to open it up to questions to the audience, but I thought I'd start things out. You mentioned there at the end about settling our differences with one another as a society. It's no secret that race relations are pretty frayed right now in this country. How bad do you think things are, and what do you think can be done about it from the perspective of someone who runs a Department of Housing and Urban Development, dealing with housing issues, dealing with poverty issues, and to the extent that that is contributing to the problem?
Well, it's a very good question. You know, what we've seen in recent years is, wedges being driven in our society with reference to race, religion, income, gender, you name it, wedges are being driven in. And as I've traveled around the country, I've been to all 50 states, I can tell you that the vast majority of the American people are decent people, quite willing to extend a helping hand to their neighbor, quite willing to sit down and have a discussion. But we have, unfortunately, rabble-rousers. We have those who are trying to convince us that we're enemies with each other. And what we have to do instead is concentrate on what draws us together, not what brings us apart. Any two people are going to have differences. You can take those differences and you can magnify them, or you can look at the things that you have in common. I love the movie Independence Day, with Will Smith. You know, these aliens were coming down. All of a sudden, the Palestinians and the Jews were best buddies, you know. But, you know, the fact of the matter is we have a lot more in common than we have that separates us, and that's what we're going to have to concentrate on. At the Department of Housing and Urban Development, I think rather than, you know, talking about a lot of things, we need to show people. We need to show people that we care. So we're creating programs that actually empower people, trying to use the same monies, for instance, to create an escrow that's associated with each housing unit. And all the routine care for that unit will come from that escrow. So if there are always holes poked in the screen and a hose in the wall and you have to call for it to be fixed, it's coming out of that escrow. But if it isn't, it continues to grow month over month, year over year. All of a sudden, you start thinking like a homeowner. Your toilet's running. I'm not calling the PHA. I'm lifting the lid. I'm going to see if I can fix it because I'm saving money. And if you leave public assistance within 5 to 10 years, you get the money for a down payment because that has been the barrier. A lot of people work very hard, but there's nowhere they're going to save that. But it also teaches them to think like a homeowner. It teaches them to think a year ahead, 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, which is how successful people think. They don't think week to week.
Do you think that this racial anxiety is a function of the economic anxiety that Americans have been experiencing in recent years?
Absolutely. You know, economic tension is the source of great dysfunction in anything. You look at marriages. You know, 2 biggest reasons that marriages break up, economic tension and, you know, other matters.
You're a government official who's long expressed skepticism of the government and government programs and feeling that they can play a somewhat limited role in helping people. So how do you strike that balance at HUD between what the government can do and what people need to do for themselves?
Well, I'm not against the concept of government. I'm against the concept of overriding government, government that tries to interfere with everything that we do. That was not how this nation was created. It was created differently, and it worked extraordinarily well. We went from nowhere to the pinnacle of the world in record time. But then we started thinking that the government is there to solve all of our personal problems. And that's what I don't like, the bureaucratic government. I don't like bureaucracy. Bureaucrats are people who think the rules are more important than the goals. And so we're in the process of changing that at HUD. And I think it's changing throughout our government. Government can be wonderful. But, you know, when we look at some of our desperate neighborhoods, when the government can come in and provide the kind of confidence and the kind of foundation that then allows the local government, charities, nonprofits, the faith community to get involved. I've seen it happen in several communities around this country. You create a thriving neighborhood, something that's wonderful that then draws other businesses in. This is the way it needs to be done. It's a new paradigm. Instead of the government riding in on the white horse with a bucket of money and saying, build this for these people, we have the government coming in and facilitating a relationship of all the involved parties, which remains a permanent relationship and provides for sustainment.
Okay. Why don't we open it up for a few questions in the back there?
Thank you very much. I'm Francis Menton, Manhattan Contrarian. So here we are in Manhattan where we have 50,000 units of low-income housing subsidized by HUD. 150,000 people live in them. Government, if you measure their value by the value of the place across the street, it's a subsidy per family of $50,000 to $100,000 per year per family, and they are all still in poverty and will be for life. What's the plan to get out of this?
Well, thank you. That's one of the reasons that we have the Envision Centers. You know, in the Bible, there's a verse that says, without a vision, the people perish. So what we've been doing over the last many decades is just throwing money at the problem and not providing a vision. What we want to do is show people what they can do, connect people with opportunities. And right now, we have right next door to each other people who need things, people who have opportunities, but they don't know about each other. The Envision Center app will make it possible to connect those people together and bring the private resources that we need together, and also helping people to be able to help themselves. We're going to start this program called Time Banking, where if you have a specific talent, you may not have a lot of money, but you know how to do something. There's somebody else who doesn't have a lot of money, but they know how to do something. How do we trade those things so that we get things done, we develop relationships, and we improve the environment? These are all things that we're eminently capable of doing, and I'm looking and have already been extremely gratified by the number of people who've been willing to help us as we try to change the paradigm. This country is full of good-hearted people. We're not the people that they portray on the news. That's not who we are. And we just need to rise above that. And I think we'll solve these problems quite effectively. I've already seen it starting to happen.
Right here. Let's wait for a mic. In front.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. I was just wondering how you compare the challenges of your present job with separating Siamese twins.
Well, I can tell you pediatric neurosurgery was more difficult because you were always juggling multiple people's lives. There were several things going on. But what we're doing now impacts more lives. It's every bit as important. And I learned a lot of things during my medical career. And one of them was no matter how talented you are, you're not going to get anything accomplished without a bunch of other people working with you. And you know, we've got a fantastic team at HUD now, people who are truly dedicated to what we're trying to do, and that is to get people out of poverty. And we're measuring success now, not how many people we can get into public housing, but how many people we can get out of it.
Right here in the middle.
Hi, I'm Steve Savitz from Baruch College. In the Reagan administration, I was at HUD as Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. We succeeded in getting the president to agree to do housing vouchers instead of building more public housing. What's going on today with housing vouchers and what may be going on in that area?
Well, you know, both programs have their pros and cons. And I like to give people a smorgasbord. I like people to have choices because for some people, a voucher is perfect. They want to go to such and such place. They don't want to be here. Other people, they want to be around the environment they're familiar with, where their family, where their friends are. But what is important is when we do revamp or build places, particularly in inner cities and places of high poverty concentrations, that we do it the right way. We do it across silos. We do it with medical care in place so that your primary care is handled there. We do it with jobs and job training in place. We do it with food so we don't have food deserts and we don't have people gouging with food. And we provide various types of opportunities for people. We built a complete community, and I love the model where we use mixed income building. I think that works extraordinarily well. I've seen it working all over the country. And you know, people develop a great deal of pride in the place where they live. And because you have the local community with a vested interest in that place thriving, it does not deteriorate like we see in public housing in the past.
Well, this raises a point we were discussing earlier about segregation and the complaint by some that America is resegregating. Do you see residential housing patterns that bother you? Do you see too many blacks clustered together, neighborhoods that are too white? Do you think it's the job of the government to sprinkle us around and make sure there's enough diversity out there?
I think that's a place where the government overreaches. I think if you create the right kind of neighborhoods, like I've seen in several places in our country, and particularly when we do it as a mixed income neighborhood, that problem solves itself.
I think we have time for one more question in the back there. Yes, straight back. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Carson. I'm a big fan of yours. Carrie Sheffield with Generation Opportunity. Can you talk about, in the new year, looking at what might be happening coming down the pike with regards to welfare reform, whether that's through Medicaid reform or work requirements and things like that? Can we expect any movement on that, and what can we do to support that?
Well, I can't give away any secrets because I might have to shoot you. So no, but that's really going to be the next push after the tax bill hopefully gets passed. I think it's going to get passed. And the interesting thing about the tax bill, people say it's for the rich, but I remind people, look at your 401k. Look at what's happened to it. Not rich people. And one of the reasons that we've had the crisis recently is because for the last 10 years, 401ks didn't do anything. You've got people trying to retire, and they don't have the money that they need. So when we create policies that work for everybody, it's extremely ameliorating to the circumstances of our country. And that's going to be the same principle that is followed with welfare reform. We're looking not to keep people comfortable in poverty, but to give them a ladder out of poverty. But unlike self-sufficiency programs in the past, we're not looking to pull the ladder out from somebody as soon as they start climbing it, because other people are watching and they say, I'm not even going to try if they're going to pull. So we have to integrate all the knowledge that we've had over these years and do this in an intelligent way. I think we clearly have the resources, the will, and the compassion to solve these problems. Thank you all very much.